Senator Gramm was chairman of the senatorial committee during a fairly difficult period of time when a Republican president who was very popular became unpopular and lost the presidency. Now, when that happens, generally incumbents lose their seats too, House members and senators. And it was predicted that the United States Senate would go from 43 senators under Senator Gramm's tenure to probably 35 or 36 United States Republican senators. And there were many people already lining up to blame Senator Gramm and to bury him politically because this would be his fault. That's the thanks you get for being the chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. That election disaster didn't take place. When the 1992 elections were over, there were still 43 Republican United States senators. There had been some turnover. Some Republicans had been defeated. Some Democrats had been defeated. 2, in fact, Democratic incumbents had been defeated in that year. Georgia's incumbent, White Fowler, was defeated by Paul Coverdale, and the North Carolina incumbent was defeated. Then in 1993, there was a special election in Texas, and Senator Gramm's hand-picked candidate, Kay Bailey Hutchison, won that election, so the Senate went to 44 Republicans. In 1994, the Senate was going to pick up 3 or maybe 5, but not a majority. And when the dust settled, the United States Senate today is comprised of 53 Republican senators, including Senator Shelby from Alabama, who changed parties, very much so at the personal persuasion of Senator Phil Gramm. In the decade prior to Phil Gramm taking over as chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, 3 Democratic incumbent United States senators had been defeated by Republican challengers. In the 4 years that Senator Phil Gramm was chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, 5 Democratic incumbents were defeated during that short period of time. And I can tell you from someone who has been involved in 2 races that there are at least 2 United States senators who would not be in the Senate today if it were not for Senator Phil Gramm. That's Paul Coverdale from Georgia and Bill Frist from Tennessee. Now, I know that firsthand, that if it were not for Phil Gramm, those 2 men would not be serving in the United States Senate. There are several others. Newt Gingrich, rightly so, has received a lot of local and a lot of national publicity for what he has done over the last several years to lay the groundwork, do the footwork, and make sure that the United States House of Representatives changed from Democrat to Republican. But the unsung hero in all of this, the person that is more singularly responsible for the United States Senate changing from Democrat to Republican, is Senator Phil Gramm, because it would still be a Democrat United States Senate if it were not for Senator Phil Gramm. I respect this man. I know him in a personal way, and it is my real pleasure to present to you a person that I can call a friend, United States Senator Phil Gramm.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. I know y'all think that those of us who are involved in politics must have kidney problems all the time from patting each other on the back. But I want to amend something that Tom said. There's no doubt about the fact that the Republican Senatorial Committee, both under my tenure and under the tenure of everybody from Barry Goldwater to me, who has been chairman, has done a good job on behalf of our candidates. But if I were going to place the real credit for winning here in Georgia and winning in Tennessee, I would say that Tom probably had more to do with those races than anybody else. Though I'm happy to take credit, I thank God every day for Paul Coverdale being in the Senate. I cannot tell you how strongly I feel about him. He is one of these remarkable people that no matter what you think of him, he always turns out to be more than you thought he was going to be. And if I were going to make a prediction today about Paul Coverdale, it would be that he is going to go down as one of the great senators that Georgia has ever sent to Washington. And Georgia has sent some great senators to Washington. I'm very happy to be here today. I want to respond to one other thing Tom said, because Tom mentioned something that was very relevant to us, both in the House and in the Senate, but was especially relevant in the Senate. We won Republican control of the Senate not in 1994, but in 1992. In 1992, with the president getting 38% of the vote, we could have easily lost 5 or 6 or 7 seats. And then we could have had a great election, and we would have been nowhere close to having a majority. So when I was asked on election night what was it that we did in this cycle that won the Senate back, I said, well, actually, it wasn't what we did in the good cycle, it was what we did in the bad cycle. And it reminded me of when the University of Texas played the University of Arkansas in 1969 for the national championship. Richard Nixon was the color commentator as president for that game. Some of you may remember it. And the University of Texas was ranked number 1, and Arkansas was ranked number 2, and Texas came out, and the first 3 times they had the football, they turned it over. And so they were behind at the end of the first half, and then in the second half, they came from behind, won the game, won the national championship. And they asked Darrell Royal, they said, well, it was your great play in the second half that won the national championship, wasn't it, Coach? He said, no. He said, actually, it was our great play in the first half. When everything we did went wrong, we played well enough to stay in the game. Actually, in the second half, the momentum was with us, and we played only just okay. So, Tom, I appreciate you remembering the bad half of the game, and Georgia was vitally important to that. I'm very happy to be here today. I'd like to talk about the election. I'd like to talk about the mandate and what I think it is. I'd like to talk a little bit about what I feel we should do now. And I want to do that in such a way as to deviate from my background as a school teacher and be brief, so that I can spend most of the time answering your questions. First of all, I don't think there's any doubt about the fact that we had an historic election. You can live a lifetime and never have an election like we had in 1994, and in fact, for a long time in my particular lifetime, I thought I was going to live it out without ever having such an election. There are a lot of indexes about how dramatic it was, but I think the most important index is the defeat of the Speaker of the House. Not since 1862 had a sitting Speaker of the House of Representatives been defeated. And as we know, looking back at that moment, that Speaker was defeated because of the Civil War and because of the withdrawal of states from the Union and the whole political turmoil that was generated by the most significant event in American history. When you start looking at the fact that the sitting Speaker was defeated in this election, the first time since 1862, I think it is a good indicator that there was something different about this election. Obviously, we turned over both houses, elected a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate. The election was significant in a couple of other ways. Number one, the Republican Party came back to life in the part of the country that it was born in. This was a great election in Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania. It was in Illinois. We had in those states massive Republican landslides where in some cases we won every statewide office on the ballot. The Republican Party truly was reborn in this election all the way down to the county level in the very part of the country where the party 130 years ago became a national political force. Secondly, the party really came into existence at the local level and at the state level as a dominant force for the first time ever in the South. I think it is, if you look at American political history, from the Civil War until the mid-60s, the South was dominated by the Democratic Party. When I was growing up, my mama thought of Republicans as, my grandmother thought of Republicans as those guys in blue shirts who burned down her grandmother's house. My father voted for Eisenhower because he had been a sergeant in the Army, and he therefore had, quote, served under Eisenhower, but he never told my grandmother. And then with the coming of the 70s, with starting in the 64 election and then building from there, the South became a dominant factor in electing Republicans president. But it did not become a dominant factor in electing Republicans to the House and Senate. What was significant about this election is that in this election we had the final breakthrough. We now have a majority of senators and House members and governors from the South who are Republicans, and in my opinion, this trend is irreversible. The final thing that was unique about this election is we lost all the close races. In 1980, we won control of the Senate by winning a total of 7 seats, including the seat in Georgia, by an aggregate total of less than 100,000 votes spread over 7 states. In other words, a very small number of votes could have totally changed the outcome of that election in the Senate and in the House. We lost the Senate in 1986, again in Georgia, but in 4 other states by an aggregate of less than 100,000 votes. In this election, we lost all the close elections. And why that is so important is that there is still a tide out there waiting to produce Republican victories. I think it is entirely possible that with a strong Republican landslide in 1996, we could win another 20 House seats in the South. So I think the political realignment, especially in the South, has now come to fruition. I do believe we are now the dominant political party in the South. I do not see that changing short of some cataclysmic event for the foreseeable future, and I think it is something that we can build on in 1996 and into the future. What did the election say? Well, I think we all have to be careful how we read it. I'm sort of like an old radio that is dialed into one station. There's one signal and I'm sort of waiting to hear. Part of the mandate I'm positive of, the other part I feel pretty certain about, but I admit, like anybody else, I'm colored by my own views and the signal I want to hear. The part of the mandate that I'm absolutely certain about is that when not one single Republican congressman, senator, or governor incumbent was defeated on Election Day, the American people clearly were rejecting the Clinton agenda. And I think the American people said, stop the taxing, the spending, and the regulating, which have been the hallmarks of the Clinton administration, and they will be stopped. There will be no tax increase in the next 2 years. There will be no new government program that is not funded by cutting other government programs, and there will be no new government regulations adopted, imposed on business, on states, on counties, on cities in the next 2 years. That's the easy part. That is the easy part of the mandate, both to read and to put into place. The second part of the mandate, I think, is a little bit harder to read and is certainly harder to implement. I believe the defining moment of the first 2 years of the Clinton administration was the health care debate. And for a substantial period of time, I think that if you were going to be placing bets in Las Vegas, you would have concluded that the president was going to win on health care. I remember vividly about 3 weeks after the president had given his speech to the joint session of Congress, when we had a Republican leadership meeting in Bob Dole's office, and we had the 4 most prominent Republican pollsters in the country. And they came in to give us a briefing on what America thought about the health care bill, and their message was a pretty sobering message. Their conclusion was that in some form Bill Clinton's health care bill was going to pass, that it was political suicide for anybody to get out front and say they were opposed to it, and that what we needed to do was to simply try to make marginal changes and to try to move the bill in our direction. Of course, you know what happened was that we did have a few people, including Paul Coverdale, who stood up and said no. The American people gradually awakened to the fact that Bill Clinton didn't have a health care bill, he had an agenda. That the adoption of that bill would have forever changed America. I mean, we weren't debating health care, we were debating the future of our country. The president had proposed having the government become the dominant decision maker in health care, basically collectivizing another 1/7 of the American economy. And the American people did not reject the plan because it would have bankrupted the government or destroyed the health care system, or because it would have decimated small business, or because it would have put people out of work. As I like to say, the final little stone that slew Goliath was freedom. And I never debated any of the other issues. I mean, if anybody wanted to talk about them, I could speak endlessly about them, but I feel that I was one of the first to recognize that the way to kill the Clinton health care bill, which we did, was to attack it on freedom. And as I said on the first day of the debate and the last day and every day in between, when my mama gets sick, I wanted to talk to a doctor and not some government bureaucrat. And when people understood that issue, the president's health care plan was dead. But more than that, I really believe it was one of those defining moments where people realized that in political terms we had a near-death experience. And I think it induced people to sort of step back and say, my God, how could this almost have happened? And it was sort of like something happens in your life and you sort of look back at the road you've been on. I don't know. I've been so lucky in my life. I guess maybe I've had these experiences, but it's sort of like something happens to somebody, and maybe it's in real terms a near-death experience, and they look back and they say, you know, this is a road I've been on, and then they look forward and they say, is that really where I want to go? Well, I really believe that in this election, that people, mostly because of health care, look back and they concluded for 40 years we've been, this health care bill was the logical extension of the road we've been on. That for 40 years, every time we've had a problem, real or imagined, the solution's always been the same: more government. I can remember when I first went to Washington as part of the public policy debate. I was a young economist at Texas A&M, and I had written a couple of articles for the Wall Street Journal on the energy crisis, and I was asked to come to Washington to testify on energy. And on my way back, this was 1975, I think, or 76, I made up this analogy to explain to my wife what I had discovered in Washington. Having been there for 2 days, I was an expert. And I said, it's as if a giant piece of paper has blown into the Capitol and affixed itself to the Capitol dome and blotted out the sun. And the liberal Democrat, and Congress thinking what's happening on Capitol Hill is happening all over the world. And so I said, the liberal Democrat rushes forward with the most powerful words ever uttered in the political debate. I have an idea. When somebody says that, step back. Because Something good or something bad is about to happen. And their idea for 40 years has been more government. In my little analogy, the idea was spend $60 billion to have the government create an artificial sun. Conservative Republicans rush forward, in my little analogy, with the weakest words ever uttered in the political debate. I don't have an idea. I ain't had an idea in 40 years. But I'm willing to compromise. We'll have the private sector build the sun, and we'll regulate it. And as I said to my wife so long ago now, nobody's saying, hey, why don't we tear that piece of paper off the top of the Capitol dome? Well, this health care bill was an extension of the dominant idea in America in the post-war period, and that's been government. We all know the uniqueness of America comes from limited government and unlimited opportunity, from the fact that in America, ordinary people like you and me have extraordinary opportunities, and we routinely do extraordinary things. But yet for 40 years, we've been in a headlong rush toward more and more government. And I think in this election, people looked at that a little, and they looked to the future, and they said, for 40 years, every time we've had a problem, we've given up more of our money, we've given up more of our freedom, and government has not solved a problem in 40 years. But what we have created is a government that's bigger, that's more expensive, that's more intrusive, and that increasingly is more hostile to us. And I think people in this election asked for their money back, their freedom back, and their country back. Now that's a tough, tough mandate. We're not going to do that in one election. We didn't get in the position we're in today because of one bad election. One good election is not going to fix every problem in America. But I believe that there is a strong element of anti-government sentiment in this election. I think it is not an overstatement to say that we had our first referendum in American history on big government, and government lost the referendum. Now, where do we go from here? Let me just comment on a couple of things. In terms of working with Bill Clinton, I'm not interested in going part way in the wrong direction. I don't think the American people gave us a majority for the first time in 40 years so that we could raise taxes half as much or spending half as much or regulation half as much as Bill Clinton and the Democrats want. I think they gave us a majority to make dramatic change, and that's what I'm committed to. I've used the analogy of a train, that the president can get on the train and be the engineer. He can wave goodbye at the station as the train pulls out, or he can get in the middle of the tracks and try to stop the train. We can live with any of the above three. What do I think we should do now? I think, first of all, it's become a common occurrence for people to come up to me and tell me, you know, they wish that so-and-so would quit saying such and such a thing. I know y'all have had similar sentiments. I think you're hearing a lot of random noise. I think comments that people would have made under ordinary circumstances that would have never got in the paper, like Jesse Helms' bad joke about the president coming to North Carolina. But you got to understand that now we're seen as governing America. And so comments are being picked up that ordinarily wouldn't. Small, irrelevant, throwaway lines that normally would have never gotten on the front page have become lead item stories. But it doesn't matter. Ultimately, what matters is what we do. Abraham Lincoln was once asked to respond to some criticism. He said he didn't have time to respond to it. That if what he was doing worked, the criticism wouldn't matter, and if it didn't work, having 1,000 angels swear he was right wouldn't matter either. So ultimately what is going to matter is not what we say, not all the random noise, not the posturing, not the promises, but the action. The question is, can we deliver? If you look at the contract with America, the glue that is necessary to hold it all together is cutting government spending. It can't work if you don't do that. And I think we have to admit to ourselves, those of us who are Republicans, and since most of y'all work for a living, I assume you're Republicans. If you're not, you should be. But if we're going to admit to ourselves as Republicans, one of our failings that we have to admit is that we want the blessings of limited government, and that often our elected officials are not willing to vote for limited government to get the blessings. Our failing has been that we have not been willing to put what we claim to be our platform into effect by being willing to tell people no when we've had an opportunity in government. And the real test of whether or not we're going to permanently realign American politics and change our country is going to be, will we cut government spending to fulfill the contract with America? And let me just, touching on that, let me just run down where I see that as being important very, very briefly, and then I'm going to stop and throw it open for questions. First of all, in both the House and the Senate platform, we promised to cut taxes on middle-income families by either doubling the dependent exemption for children or giving a child tax credit. I prefer doubling the dependent exemption, but they work exactly the same. You've got to come up with $75 billion to pay for that over 5 years. Now, my view is that what we ought to do is take the budget of Department of Education, Health and Human Services, HUD and independent agencies. Those are agencies that are supposed to be helping middle-income families. Let's cut their budget by 40% and give the money back to families by doubling the dependent exemption for children and let them spend their own money. Now, the Democrats will say, oh, you're cutting housing, you're cutting spending for nutrition, you're spending for education. Our response has got to be, oh, no, we're not. We're changing who is doing the spending. You want the government to do the spending. We want the family to do the spending. We know the government, we know the family, we know the difference. Now, the media is going to scream and holler and criticize and say, well, you're hurting this group, and they're going to generate the Clinton administration will generate all the data about how much money Georgia's losing in education and how much they're losing in housing and how much they're losing in welfare. But the point is, nobody is going to be able to calculate how much working families are gaining. Well, we know the two equal each other because if we commit the cuts to the tax cut, we know we're transferring the ability to spend money from government to families. If we can't do that, the contract's not going to work. And if we can't do that, we don't deserve to govern America. I'm determined to see that that happens. We're going to have a big debate about capital gains tax cuts, and we're going to have some people who are going to argue that there's no revenue lost in cutting capital gains tax rates, and in the long run, they're right. But it's not a debate I'm interested in getting involved in. I'm not looking for an excuse not to cut government spending. Knowing Congress as I do, I am not worried that Congress is going to cut government spending too much. Of all the things I worry about when I go to bed at night, I am always asleep before I get around to that worry. And so my proposal, I want to cut the capital gains tax rate in half, and I want to index it for inflation. It costs $56 billion in, quote, static scoring over 5 years to do that. I want to then write into the bill that if revenues from capital gains actually exceed the projections that are made in this static estimate of revenue loss, that each year as those revenues are recorded, that we automatically cut the capital gains tax further. Then, if the Democrats are right, we've cut spending and the deficit doesn't change, and if we're right, we may well eliminate the capital gains tax. That's the way I think we need to approach that kind of problem. Finally, in terms of welfare, I think it's going to be the dominant issue in this Congress. I think it is going to be in this Congress what health care was in the last Congress. It is going to be a very tough issue. I think it is clear what we ought to do, but I think doing it is going to be very difficult. And just to throw out a couple of points that I think are very, very clear. The biggest problem in welfare today in terms of getting people to take jobs is that for most people who are riding in the wagon, they are better off than they would be working. And the first principle I would set down on welfare is a very simple principle. Nobody riding in the wagon is better off than anybody pulling it. And I'll just give you a figure that I've latched onto. It's hard for me to open my mouth without saying it, but we have just calculated out, been a new study that shows that in your big cities like Washington, Detroit, Chicago, New York, that the average welfare recipient with one dependent child with the 4 major welfare programs qualifies for benefits that in pre-tax dollars would cost you over $21,000 a year to buy. I hire Harvard graduates to go to work in my office for about $18,000 a year. There is no finite amount of training. I mean, Bill Clinton and the Democrats would have us believe all you got to do is train these people. It fixes all our problems. There is no training that has ever existed or will ever exist on the face of the earth that is going to make a high school dropout worth $21,000 a year the first day they enter the labor market. Forget it. I mean, you could send them to Harvard and Yale and MIT, and it wouldn't do it. The first thing we're going to have to do is cut welfare benefits so that a lady who is out working 2 jobs to take care of her children is not worse off than people who refuse to work. The second change we got to make is have the mandatory work requirement not in some government make work, quote, public service job. If you do that, having people work costs you money. Why should it cost money to have people work? My proposed solution is to have a work requirement in the private sector of the economy. Exempt people on welfare from the minimum wage and let them go out and get any job they can get. And if they only earn $2.50 an hour, there is dignity in that labor. We can supplement their income so that they have enough money to live on. They're acquiring the real job training. As anybody in the real world knows, an unskilled laborer is someone who can get up every morning and go to work, more or less pay attention for 8 hours and take verbal instruction. A skilled laborer is someone who can always get up and go to work, work 5 days a week, come back the next Monday and take written instruction. That's a skilled laborer in America. And we're all looking for them in the Senate, House, for president. We cannot go on encouraging people to have more and more children when they're on welfare. It is suicidal for our society, and it has got to change. Those are the kind of dramatic changes we need to make. They're going to be the media and the people riding in the wagon, and more importantly, the people that are steering the wagon. All of these people who profiteer off the welfare system, who profit from it, they're going to scream and they're going to holler and they're going to generate every horror story you ever heard of. It's going to test our courage, it's going to test our leadership, but if we really love these 40 million people, if we want to give them access to the American dream, we're going to have to make these changes. They may hate us for it, but their children and their grandchildren will love us for it, and we will love our country better if we do it. Not having totally deviated from my background as a school teacher, I got about 15 minutes. Let me stop, throw it open. I'd be very happy to try to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
Senator, you made no mention of the deficit problem, and most of all, especially since you're an economist, the national debt of $5.3 trillion. No matter what politicians do in Washington, this is an accounting which sooner or later is going to have to come due. Your thoughts, your comments?
Well, we're going to have to do 2 things in writing our budget. We're going to have to make progress in deficit reduction, and we're going to have to offset the things that we have committed to the American people that we're going to do. I think that we are going to have to apply something like my Dickey Flat test. I mean, if you start out with the approach that everything the government's doing it ought to do and we ought to just do it more efficiently or or modified a little, you say, how can we possibly get there? But on the other hand, if you take the view that, well, should there be a Department of Education? Should the federal government be choosing winners and losers with some $40 billion worth of corporate subsidies a year? Should the federal government pay operating losses on mass transit? Not capital expenditures, operating losses. When you got 72 networks on most cables, should we spend $1 billion a year to have a public television station? I mean, if you apply the Dickey Flat test, where you think of a real worker and you ask a question, are the benefits to be derived by spending money on this program be worth taking the money away from Dickey Flat to pay for it, the deficit problem evaporates pretty quickly. Dick Armey and I have done a lot of work on this problem. It is going to be a very difficult thing for us to do. I think people are ready to do it. We're certainly going to put them to the test. Yeah.
How do you feel about radical tax reform generally, and more specifically, Army's flat tax proposal, and also Archer's idea of replacing the income tax with a national sales tax?
Well, let me start with Archer and work backwards. I am very fearful of that proposal because I don't think we'll be successful, and I think we'll end up with both, and I don't want to do that. We are at least 2 elections away from being able to realistically debate Army's proposal. It has a hidden agenda, and that is you got to cut government spending by 30% in order to make it work over a 10-year period. So we better cut the spending by 30% first. I am for movement toward a flat tax. I think the most important thing for us to remember is that people expect us to deliver now. And I think the worst thing we could do is start firing shells 200 miles over the battle line and not killing anybody. What we have got to do is focus on what is doable. What is doable is doubling the dependent exemption for children and cutting the capital gains tax rate and indexing it. So my goal is, let's do that this year. Next year, I want to eliminate the marriage penalty, which is a big item, big bucks. But why should 2 young professionals who love each other pay the federal government $5,000 a year for the joy of being married? My wife is worth $5,000 a year. But I don't want to put that to the test with everybody. I'm not sure that it's equally true of me. So what I'm saying is that the temptation is to, just as you're getting ready to jump over the bar, after working long and hard to do it, is to raise the bar. I think it's a very real mistake, and I'm not going to do it. I want to win on what we promised to do now, and next year win on something else. I think we've got to learn from the Fabians, socialists. They ended up socializing America, and to a large extent, Great Britain, and to a large extent America, by simply taking whatever they could get at the time and then building on it. We've got to do the same thing. Yes, sir.
We hear a lot about government spending cuts. Being in healthcare, I have a fear that the private sector already supports and subsidizes some of the federal programs that are out there because they run so inefficiently. I guess part of our fear is that if you already take a wounded dog who's got one bad leg and you shoot him in the other leg, by just cutting $70 million out of an organization that already runs inefficiently, is the burden on the private sector going to grow? Is there any thoughts to making those organizations more efficient rather than just simply cutting money out of their spending?
Well, I don't consider health care reform to have anything to do with simply reducing reimbursement for Medicare and Medicaid. The untold story of the health care debate is that while the president kept talking about uncompensated care, principally coming from people who don't have health insurance, imposing a cost on the system, for every dollar they imposed on private health, people that had private health insurance, the government imposes $2 by undercompensating for Medicare and Medicaid. So I am for reforming programs like Medicaid. I think there ought to be a co-payment in Medicaid. I think that there ought to be a co-payment that is triggered by the income and including the value of things they get from the government, so that people that are getting Medicaid have a threshold to consume health care like everybody else. Those are the kind of reforms that I want to undertake. I'm not going to vote for cuts where you're simply shifting the cost to somebody else. Yes, sir.
I'm very scared about the press at the moment. I've been yelling at the television since the election because of the way things have been spun. Like you said, it's going to be hard to overcome the shrill people. And the example is just at the second orphanages were even mentioned, the very next night, the lead-in to CNN presenting that, I don't know if anybody saw it, was 2-year-old file tape from a Romanian orphanage. With that kind of opposition, Clinton thinks his problem is great ideas and bad message. We've got great ideas. How do we get our message on a par with their machine?
Well, let me respond by saying that, first of all, we've got to admit to ourselves that it's going to be hard. The media feels that it helped create the system we have now, and they're not going to like sitting idly by while we tear their child down. I mean, that's just, for the vast majority of the people in the media, they know the system now. Even if they're not for it, they know it. They know how it works. They know how to report on it. I mean, think of all the political writers who understand how government works, who are going to be out of work if we start letting the market system work, and they don't know how to write about it. I mean, it's a simple vested interest. What we're going to have to do is, number one, we're going to have to learn from our mistakes. I am blessed in that, given my particular variant of accent, I cannot say orphanage. I just can't say it. And it's somewhere it has to do with R being near a vowel or something, but I just can't say it. If others were afflicted with a similar speech problem, we'd be better off. Secondly, look, what we've got to do, you got to understand, we're in a learning process. And I make plenty of mistakes. I make at least one mistake every day. I try not to make the same mistakes over and over. When we were suddenly in the majority, things we were saying were making news that ordinarily would not have made news. And that when you've never had that kind of coverage, you want more and more of it. Part of what our people are going to have to learn is that some coverage you don't want. I think Newt and Dick Armey and I all suffer from problem from our academic background. And that when somebody asks us a question, we feel like we got to rear back and knock it out of the park. One of the things I've come to understand, I think, from just hard knocks is you don't want to swing at every ball. You want to wait on a good ball. You can't knock the ball out of the park every time. And we've got to have the discipline to talk about what we want to talk about. It also means that if you're going to get coverage on your ideas and your program, that it may not make sense to be on a Sunday show every Sunday. It's not an accident that the president does not do it. Why doesn't he do it? When you're on the Sunday show, they get to choose what you talk about. You don't get to choose it. So the president wants to choose what he wants to talk about. So you all see the headline where, all of a sudden one of our new emerging leaders is talking about some so-and-so, and you say, why in the hell would he ever bring that subject up? Point is, he didn't bring it up. Somebody asked him on Meet the Press. Finally, part of leading is discipline in recognizing the rules of the game. When I was coaching little boy football, we had a lot of bad officiating. And I, at first, complained about it, got mad about it, and it demoralized me and demoralized the team. Once I had grown up after a game or two, I just simply adjusted the game plan to the officiating and played harder. And if you know that the media is not going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and if they're going to zap you when you make a mistake, you're careful. You think things through a little more thoroughly. You don't take the verbal risk and you give up the good zinger, the great line, to protect yourself against having what you're doing or saying misrepresented. I'm not worried about all this stuff. I think in the end, if we do the job, it won't matter what we say. But I know people are frustrated about it now.
So I can rest easy. They're not going to win.
Oh, I don't know that that's true.
We can outmaneuver the press.
We can, but it's going to be hard. Last question.
One thing I find it very significant that the media ignores is that if government quits interfering with the private sector, there'll be far less need for lobbyists and far less spent on lobbying and any kind of issue-related advertising. But some find it very hard to understand for some strange reason. Can that message be gotten out?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you're assuming that the media really cares about the number of lobbyists. The assault on lobbyists is an assault on citizen involvement in the legislative process. Remember, political power is a zero-sum game. Government has power because it spends $1.5 trillion a year, because it sets the power of milk, sets the price of milk, and because it's a dominant player in a lot of markets, both as a regulator and a participant. No amount of limiting campaign contributions or lobby reform in any way changes that. All it does is redistribute the power. Whenever anybody is talking to you about lobbying reform or campaign reform, in the back of your mind think, now, what is this guy's angle? What does he want? Only I speak for the public interest in these areas. That was a joke. Anybody else who's arguing for campaign reform they figured out how to make themselves more powerful. Why do newspapers want to limit campaign contributions? Their endorsements are more powerful. Why do groups like the teachers groups want to limit citizen involvement? Because they can be involved because they got large numbers. Their endorsement is valuable. So that's not the problem. The problem is that government spends $1.5 trillion a year. It sets the price of milk. It does all these other things that give it power. If you're worried about somebody influencing it, stop it from doing those things. Then the only reason they'll want to influence it is for the same reason that you established this foundation, because you love your country and you like being free. And that's the kind of influence we want. Thank you very much.